Hello and welcome to the Veracious Show. My name's Lorne Risley. I'll be your host for this episode as always. Been a week, man. Been a crazy week. Work kicking my ass. YouTube proving to be really difficult to churn out what I need to churn out. Twitter blowing up, getting into arguments with everybody, which is the topic of discussion on this podcast. Considering that I originally recorded a version on Saturday morning, which I've decided not to release for various reasons. It's just far too visceral, far too aggressive. I wanted to rein it in a little bit and touch on a few of the same points that I wanted to make in that podcast in this one. But I wanted to kick off this podcast with Twitter and my involvement with it recently. Something that I've noticed, which is intriguing. And in fact, I've known this all my life in terms of, for people that haven't followed my stuff on YouTube or don't know me personally, I'm a pretty argumentative guy. I question everything. I'm the sort of person that always looks at things from a slightly different slant than most people, because I like to, I provoke people. I'm an agitator. It's kind of what I do. It's something that I've done since I was a kid. There's not a lot I can do about it at this stage in my life. It's a mindset, it is what it is. But when it comes to debate, it often serves me quite well, because I often look at things from the perspective of an individual rather than as, what do I think the most amount of people, what sentiment do I think is going to be mirrored by the most amount of people? What do I think is going to get me the most views or the most degrees or the most clicks or whatever? I'm always the sort of person that tries to seek the truth in things. And what I've found recently is that truth, or at least my truth, I probably shouldn't say the truth, because everything is subjective these days. Facts aren't even facts anymore. We can't even agree on a basis of comparison for a lot of very simple things that we once could. Anyway, I digress. I find that the pursuit of my truth is often quite difficult, because I'm often quite happy to question someone's standpoint on things, because I think what I'd do is I'd just kick off with the example that's prompted this podcast, which is quite simply, I'm talking, tweeting at the moment about a WWE event that's just been released. Hulk Hogan is going to be reinstated into the WWE Hall of Fame. And I have a bit of an issue with this, considering that I don't feel there's anything that justifies that from the perspective of, well, he was removed for a reason. And to say that he's now back in for no other reason than, well, we've got to make some money. We've got to shift some shirts. He's a money maker. He's used to be an ambassador. He's a recognized face and a recognized name. Okay, I get that. Here's my problem though. My truth in this situation was this. He has been removed from the Hall of Fame. There are individuals who are deserving of a spot in the Hall of Fame that will probably never get a whiff. And my example was China, a professional wrestler who was prominent in the early to mid 90s, was released towards the back end of the 90s or early part of 2000s, I forget, and suffered what can only be described as a spiral in her life, leading to her death, unfortunately. She became involved in the adult film industry and was, known for her drug abuse and things of that nature. But she will never get a whiff of the Hall of Fame. And the reason why I think that was sad was because she is the only woman who could have legitimately held what is effectively now the men's heavyweight title of the world, the most prominent and prestigious title in all of wrestling. And she was within 2 matches of doing this. Circumstances were such, though, that, she didn't, and that's a shame, but, that c'est la vie, as they say. However, that kind of contribution, I think, is going to be overlooked in years to come. There are kids growing up now who will never know who China was. She's going to be eradicated from history. And the simple reason for that is because she was fucking the guy who's now running the place, who he then left to get with the daughter of the boss so that he could continue his climb in the business. We could get into the moral ambiguity that surrounds that, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. What I'm here to talk about is this. That simple confrontation of, well, hang on a second. Hulk Hogan was disqualified from his spot as a privilege to be in the Hall of Fame. He was deserving initially, of course, because of his legacy as a great draw in the 1980s, his turn in the NWO for WCW prompting one of the greatest skyrockets of business that professional wrestling has ever seen, if not the greatest. And of course was a great ambassador. However, his comments were, unfortunately, this comes from personal experience. What I find is this: people who make those kinds of statements and have those kinds of dispositions may apologize when they're caught, but I can guarantee you he will hold those sentiments to the day he dies. He comes from a generation that was inherently racist. It's not a great thing to admit as a culture. We like to think we're better than this, but again, speaking from personal experience, I see racism all the time. It's casual, it's flippant. Even people that are subject to it seem almost like they're on board with it at times, which makes me incredibly sad, because I'm not sure they realise it sometimes that the intention from which it's been directed is not... I don't think it should ever be a joke. I don't think anyone should be called brown or black as a joke, especially when it's someone using the terminology who isn't that same ethnicity. Just a personal preference of mine. I think, yes, it's all okay or it isn't, but in that particular sense, the intent, again, I come back to my three rules. What is the intent? What is the context? And what was the delivery? What was the execution like? And the intent is always critical with that. And I always believe the intent is to demean and debilitate. Hogan was racist. He was, and it wasn't even if it was said in the best of context in the first place, it was said during a sex tape. I mean, the fact that these two individuals in particular I find interesting to compare, because China is never going to get a whiff of the Hall of Fame. And the proposed reason for this is because she was in the porn industry and she has a history of drug abuse. Hulk Hogan was caught saying racist rhetoric during a sex tape and was known for his use of steroids. It was a notable change in his physique from the 1980s to the 1990s. Why? Because he was on the juice. So this is where I came in and I said, well, hang on a second, where is your distinction being drawn here? Because for me, these two individuals are both in the same position. They're not in the Hall of Fame, yet you're going to let one of them in now. You're making the wrong decision, because there's one of them that by any standard should have got in but didn't, and one that was in and is now out. And there's a reason for it. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because it was a simple tweet. I'll read the tweet. Where is it? Let's go. I'm professional these days. I prepare for my podcast, so I'm sure I'm going to at least one of these days. Go home. Where are we? There we are. So, tweets and replies. By the way, did I mention follow me on Twitter? It's a riot. You'll get so frustrated reading my tweets. So the tweet was this, simple. The original tweet was something along the lines of, I'm so happy to see him reinstated, childhood hero of mine, yada, yada, yada. Mine was, I'd sooner see Chyna in the Hall of Fame than Hulk back in. That's it. That was it. There was nothing else beyond that initial tweet. No inference of a comparable nature between the two or anything along those lines. It was just, hey, if it were me, I'd sooner see Chyna back in. The response I thought was interesting, because the response was, what a ridiculous statement. And one of his later defenses is, this is just my personal opinion. Well, then why are you attacking me for my personal opinion? I'll call him out. The guy's name's Kenny McIntosh. He's a professional wrestling analyst, interviewer, expert. A guy I have I'm not even going to say I did have. I still have a tremendous amount of respect for him for what he's achieved, his presentation, his formats and his media, his platforms. I followed his stuff over the last couple of years, having been a fan of What Culture and the guys from that channel. And Kenny McIntosh was particularly prominent on the early stages in terms of the more legitimate interviewing side of the business. He didn't, from my recollection, he didn't appear in too many videos. He was more in the sense of interviewing people. But alas, we have to come to this. So what a ridiculous statement. Without his contributions, WWE wouldn't be a company that allowed China or anyone else to compete. Personal opinions aside, come on. Now the reason why I raise this is because this is not the first time this has happened to me over the last couple of weeks, where I confront something that I think is a fallacy, even if it's just a relatively simplistic statement. The defensiveness of the retort and the personal attack are always indicative of tactics used by people who are on the losing side of an argument, who maybe realise that they've said something that is erroneous and somewhat silly without any real basis for a valid argument, and wish to tear down me as a person first before actually taking down my argument. So here's my argument in this instance. Well, you're putting someone in who you feel deserves to be in there, despite the fact that they were taken out for these reasons. Well, why is this person not in? More to the point, why is this person not getting in first before the other person? Considering that if we're going to just notch it, she deserves to be in there, having never been in there. He deserved to be in there, but was removed for various reasons. Now, the response to that, I thought, was... we might have an interesting retort here. We might have to get into that a little bit later. However, what I thought was interesting about the whole thing was that you have to confront these things. You have to. If you blindly go along with narratives, and if you fail to see the deeper elements of any argument and the inherent complexities that you put forward when you try to express an opinion, that you have to make sure it's well-rounded, especially in a public sphere. And yet when people are challenged on this, they get defensive and they become almost, not abusive. Abusive is too strong a word, I would argue. I don't feel I've been subject to any abuse, let's put it that way. Nothing that didn't just make me laugh because of how adorable it ended up being. I love the insult and block tactic as well. That always lets me know I've won an argument. But in this instance, I genuinely feel that through the prism of Twitter, we see an age where people are not ready to back up their arguments in a productive way. You see a lot of insults, you see a lot of backtracking and double entendre, you see a lot of fallacies with people's arguments. And the point I wanted to make with this podcast is this, using the wrestling as the example, and also referring back to my transgender tweets, which, you know, related to Scarlett Johansson, who sadly is stepped down from the role, and you know that was what the original podcast was going to be about. You know, the fact that oh wow! So I'm just noticing. I'm reading the again. You got to love people. So this guy who's tweeted me back with something that I would consider to be a fairly erroneous statement. Let's have a look. China, the woman who falsely accused Esbag of raping her, but Hogan saying a bad word is worse. The mind of a mark. Okay, we'll deconstruct that argument later. But following 1,026 people and has 12 followers of his own. Sounds legit. But anyway, this comes from the mind of someone that has to deconstruct arguments on a constant basis. And all I really wanted to say at the end of this podcast was this. On the transgender bit thing, just coming back to that, it's a blow for free speech. It's a killer for creative freedom. The fact that she was bullied out of a role by people that are pontificating against bullying. It's ultimate irony. It's almost delicious in the way it flips on its head. And I guess the reason I'm most sad by this is because in the debate with, and I know she listened to one of my podcasts. I'm not entirely sure she listened to the whole thing. If she did, you know, I apologise profusely for insinuating that she might not have done. It's just that some of the statements that she made afterwards to me directly, you know, I'll come clean. We had a conversation via Twitter, via direct messaging shortly afterwards, about a week, because I didn't realise you can get requests page on DMs. Who knew? Just basically retorting and going back and forth, and again agreeing to disagree to a certain extent, even though I still feel that there's a misunderstanding of sorts there. Clearly a very educated lady, you know, I'll give her that, but I think still has a somewhat naive grasp on the subject matter based on the emotive intent behind her narrative. Anyway, the point was, though, that was someone who I felt I could reasonably debate, and who was, if given enough time in the proper format, might be willing and open to some kind of compromises. I'm always open to some degree of compromises if a good argument is placed at my feet. If you're going to insult me and question my character before you address my argument, I'm sorry, that's not a debate. And the what ifs, well, hang on a second, well, what about this person? Well, if it relates to the subject matter, then yes. But just to say, oh, well, what about this person, what about this person? Well, if they're two completely different and unrelated events, you can boil any moral argument down to a fallacy of, well, nothing has any meaning. Nothing's wrong and nothing's good, so why bother? Well, no, things have degrees. Things can be judged on different merits. And I strongly believe that. But coming back to the Twitter debate with the transgender arguments, I genuinely felt sad when I saw that she'd backed down. And the response of the community was something along the lines of a victory. It was a moral victory. Okay, great. Unfortunately for those same people, you've opened the door for similar tactics to be utilized by people who I guarantee you do not want having those kind of tactics at their disposal. I guarantee it. You can only beat debate. You can only beat argument with a better argument, in my opinion. In this case, the debate and the argument was beaten by the loudest voices with the angriest rhetoric. In this particular debate with Kenny McIntosh, it wasn't really much of a debate. I've got to be honest, it was a couple of tweets back and forth, and he's probably not going to think anything of it. And more power to him. You know, I'm a very, very, very small channel. Minute channel, minuscule channel, and I'm, as a person, very, very minute with very little social reach. However, I do believe my opinion matters to me, and that's all that matters. But anyone say, well, your opinion doesn't matter. Well, motherfucker, it does to me. Your opinion matters to me, and I don't mind saying that, because everyone's opinion should matter. Everyone gets their 2 cents, everybody. The ill-informed, the informed, the emotive, the complicit, every single person gets their argument. And that's the way it has to be. But at the same time, the people who have an argument should listen to the people who maybe don't have a dog in the fight. And then also have the objectiveness to look at it from a purely moral perspective and decide for themselves based on empirical evidence and circumstantial evidence, rather than just, well, what do I feel is the right answer here? So, to summarize, if you struggle with debating people, and I doubt you do, because I'm probably the only person that debates on Twitter. It's such a bad format for it. Alas, if you're the sort of person that needs to speak their truth or find their truth, and you find that people, when confronted with their arguments, become quite defensive and attack you, then usually that's a sign that you've struck a nerve that's correct, and you should definitely pull on that thread. If you feel intimidated to pursue that truth, then that's all the more reason to pursue it. So long as your argument is well-founded, well-researched, balanced, considered, then I don't see any reason why anyone shouldn't be able to confront anyone with anything. In my cases, those 2 instances, I confronted a fallacy in someone's argument with someone saying that no one who isn't transgender should be allowed to take a transgender role, when that's hilariously flawed as an argument. I actually kind of like the person I was debating, because again, even after the initial statements, which I thought were frankly ridiculous, we were able to have a reasonably productive conversation, and again afterwards via direct message. In the case of Kenny McIntosh, I understand he probably has a lot of voices shouting, and being a YouTube personality, I have 100 and something odd subscribers and I struggle to keep up with my comments. So having thousands and thousands of subscribers all as passionate as wrestling fans must be an absolute nightmare. To have some guy perk up and say that, maybe he felt inclined to go on the attack straight away, I don't know. But I just feel, again, there's a fallacy of his argument that deserved to be confronted. So, in summary, people, be bold. Don't be afraid to question something and to instigate if you have to. But just make sure you've balanced it, and just make sure you've considered your argument as well as you can to make sure that you have your facts straight and you have as much empirical evidence to draw upon, because it will serve you well in those situations. So, I'm going to bring this edition of the Veracious Show to an end. It's a little bit shorter episode than usual. The reason being is because, like I said, the initial podcast that I recorded on Saturday morning was far too angry and visceral. It wouldn't have done anyone any good me releasing that one. So I'm much more chilled and relaxed. Much more objective in my approach to try and encompass two different stories into one, which is, sure, debate people on Twitter. I wouldn't dissuade you from doing it. Just make sure you approach it in a good vein and with a good spirit, and I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. So, if anyone has any questions or queries, or they'd like me to debate me on Twitter, follow me. I'm at Lorne Risley, so I'm super easy to find. I hope you're enjoying the Veracious shows. I hope you're enjoying the recent editions of Halcyon I've been releasing. I'm releasing every single week on a weekend from now on. I promise you, one video at least every single week. Once I get into the habit, I'll try and crank out two along with the Veracious show, just to give you guys the kind of level of content that I want to release, and hopefully go from there. So, this has been your host, Lorne Risley. This has been the Veracious Show. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. I hope you're having a good week. I hope you have a great week ahead of you. And as always, I'll see you on the next episode.